Chad is a very unfortunate character. Due to his track record, he's often seen as a joke within the anime community as a whole, and a lot of times if you ever see a list that talk about like the most wasted characters in shonen, he's usually on those. And that's not to say that Chad is a bad character. In fact, it's the opposite. People actually like Chad, and the reason that he's said to be a wasted character is because he just ends up not really accomplishing much. Anytime Chad goes up against someone of actual importance within the series, he ends up pretty much just getting destroyed. And while I don't blame anybody for it, this has convinced a lot of people that Chad is weak. Now, Chad is no Ichigo, but he is significantly stronger than most people give him credit for. And there are lots of key details within the series that point to this that people just kinda end up glossing over. So, spoiler warning, I'm going to be talking about Chad's character throughout pretty much the entirety of the series, including the Thousand Year Blood War. Now, in the beginning of the series, Chad was able to fight off a hollow even without being able to see them. He was that strong just naturally. However, it's kind of difficult to place him in this arc because he didn't really get his powers until the end of it. Things kick off for his character a little bit when we go into the Soul Society arc, because in order to rescue Rukia, he trained under Yoruichi with Orihime. Because of this training, Chad was now able to use the powers of his new arm and actually had spiritual control. Now, how much stronger did this training actually make Chad? Well, like I said before, it's kind of hard to say how strong Chad was in the first arc because he didn't really get his power until the end of it. However, we do know that he was likely much weaker than the likes of Uryu and Ichigo. And at the end of the Substitute Shinigami arc, when Renji and Byakuya came to get Rukia back and take her back to the Soul Society, Renji absolutely bodied Uryu and dominated Ichigo for the majority of the fight until he tapped into his latent power and was kind of killing himself while doing it. Point being that a 20% lieutenant was pretty much too much for Ichigo and Uryu at that point in time, and if not, very, very close in power. So by comparison, I would say that Chad at that point was probably around the level of a 5th or a 4th seat. However, it should be noted that they didn't really fully recover from the Menos yet, and while I'm not saying that he's weaker than a normal lieutenant, it should also be noted that Renji is something of a recently appointed lieutenant at this point in the series. Now, heading back into the Soul Society arc, they have all obviously gotten stronger. However, it should be noted that Chad somewhat closed the gap a little bit here. While Ichigo is still considered the strongest and his path is a little bit harder, they all end up going down a very similar path. And what I mean by this is that in the very beginning, they all have to do very similar things. They put their spirit energy in a ball so that way they can access the Soul Society, right? None of them are stated to be more powerful than the other here, just different. For example, Ichigo's is unstable while Chad's is just strong. When they all get split off, they'll have their own ways of dealing with the foot soldiers. After they end up dealing with the foot soldiers, they run into a seated officer. And then after everyone runs into a seated officer, they run into a captain. All of Ichigo, Uryu, and Chad run through this exact same path, with the little difference being that Ichigo's seated officer was actually pretty much a lieutenant, unless you include his Bankai, which then he's a little higher than that. But with the Shikai, Ikaku is basically a lieutenant. Both Uryu and Chad easily defeated their seated officer, and Ichigo did struggle a little bit, but again, Ikaku is basically a lieutenant, so his path was a little harder. And on a side note, this is actually really crazy to me, because one of the main reasons that I made this video is because I saw someone say that end of series Chad is probably around the level of a 4th seat. And in this arc, he one-shots a 3rd seat with a no-name punch. And I know that's not most people, but it's just kind of like what I meant when I say that some people just kind of ignore or don't really catch all the details when it comes to the things regarding Chad. And this is kind of where Chad's downfall begins. Because when Ichigo runs into his captain, Kenpachi, he stands no chance. But he gets a power-up when he works together with the Zangetsus. When Uryu goes up against Mayuri, he actually puts up a pretty decent fight, but then again, Mayuri is weaker than Kenpachi, but he has a power-up in his Let Steel, which allows him to win the fight. They both end up winning or tying, depending on how you look at it, but Chad gets no such power-up, and at this point in time, Shunsui is so much stronger than Mayuri and Kenpachi in this arc that it's actually kind of funny. Like, he is so much stronger that Ichigo, Chad, and Uryu could jump him, and they would still stand no chance. So while entering the arc, there probably wasn't too much of a difference between Ichigo, Uryu, and Chad. Chad got no power-ups like the other two, and he ran into a much stronger enemy, which pretty much ended his story in that arc. However, there is some very important details in this fight that I don't see people talk about too often. For starters, this is where we see a weakness that Chad needs to overcome within the next arc. That being that, except for his arm, he is mostly a normal human, and what I mean by that is that Chad is kind of slow compared to some characters. Now, obviously, Shunsui is extremely fast, right? But Chad does not have a Hirin Kyaku. He does not have a form of Flash Step. He does not have anything special other than his arm. And no matter how powerful your attack is, if you can't really hit the enemy with it, it's almost useless. And that's the thing. Chad's attacks are very powerful. Shunsui noted that it would have been bad if Chad's final attack hit him, where he basically put all of his energy into his, last attack. And this is Shunsui that we're talking about here. Think about the people this man has fought. He has never had a power up. He has just always been a menace. Chad is packing some serious power behind his punch, and I would say that this easily makes him lieutenant level at this point in the series, where Ichigo and Uryu might have hit that captain level combatant with their power-ups within the arc. Chad not getting any power-up at all and being lieutenant level is very consistent with him being relatively the same level as them going into the arc. And you gotta keep in mind, even Ichigo on his generational run in this arc was only lieutenant level at one point. I mean, he basically lost to Renji. He only survived that fight because of the Hollow Mask, which is something that we do not talk about enough, I feel. So Chad leaves the Soul Society arc with about the power of a lieutenant, maybe higher in terms of raw power, but he doesn't have the speed or the techniques that any normal lieutenant of his strength would have. And in the very beginning of the Arrancar arc, it is reinforced that Chad definitely needs an upgrade, especially in speed when he almost got killed by D-Roy, who isn't particularly a strong Arrancar, definitely at least lieutenant level or something like that, but the point being that Chad basically couldn't even react to him. But can you blame the dude at this point? He's mostly a normal human. And it's at this point that we see Chad begin the train at Kisuke's house with Renji. Now, after this training, I would say that Chad is somewhat close to Ichigo in his Shikai at this point. And there's a couple of things that lead me to believe this. First is that in the next invasion that involved Luffy, Yami, and Grimmjow, the only reason that Chad and Renji didn't go to intercept, like last time where Renji was there, was because Kisuke said they were too exhausted from training, so he went himself. And not because he didn't consider them strong enough. Next is when they enter Hueco Mundo. Now, heading into Hueco Mundo, you may know that this arc is somewhat of a reflection of the Soul Society arc, and there is no exception for the trio of Chad, Uryu, and Ichigo here. In the very beginning of the arc, they admit that Ichigo is the strongest of the trio. Then, just like in the Soul Society arc with the Spirit Orb, they have a little showing to say that their power levels aren't necessarily that different. It's just that their strength lies in different places. And while this time it doesn't include Ichigo, Uryu and Chad both face off against the Rancars, and they end up switching opponents to show that Chad is more suited to fighting the high-strength brute, while Uryu is more suited to fighting the ranged speedy boy. And then again, just like in the Soul Society arc, they all go down their own path, which ends up becoming very similar. First, they run into a Pre-Verona Espada, and then an actual Espada. And here is where I feel like it's important to make the distinction between a Fraction and a Pre-Verona Espada. From what we've seen, Fraction do vary quite a bit in terms of strength. However, they mostly sit at about that lieutenant level area. Not only has almost every single Fraction that we've seen fight had a difficult fight against the lieutenant, but one of Baragon's Fractions actually made it a big deal out of him being captain level, even though it was implied by Shuhei that he's not really there yet. It's pretty safe to say that at most a Fraction is a very strong lieutenant, maybe crossing into that very weak captain level combatant. Now, Pre-Verone are a little bit different. Saruchi was able to put up a fight against Uryu, who was able to put in work against multiple Espada. Dordoni, who is largely considered the strongest Pre-Verone, was able to box with Bankai Ichigo, although he did get destroyed when he put on his Hollow Mask. And Luffy, who was Grimmjow's replacement, was able to fight multiple lieutenants at the same time easily and to temporarily take a captain out of commission. Now, Luffy did not defeat Toshiro, he got back up and froze him. However, Luffy also left that fight practically unharmed. And there's no way that Toshiro was just sitting down there letting everything happen, because if Kisuke hadn't gotten involved, Rangiku would have died. And it should also be noted that Luffy was not chosen to replace Grimmjow because he was the strongest Pre-Verone Espada. In the light novels, it was stated that the only reason he was chosen over some of the other Pre-Verone is because his aspect of death matched matched Grimchow's. Point being that while it might be on the mid to lower end of it, Privarones are captain level material, compared to Fraction, who are more like lieutenants. And if you need more convincing on that end, there would be literally no reason for the Privarone Espada to even exist in the story if it wasn't for there to be a distinction between them and Fraction in terms of power. If the story wasn't trying to tell you that there was a difference, then the enemies that Ichigo, Uryu, and Chad fought would have just been Fraction because they were already established within the story, other than like lore reasons. But like I said earlier, this is important because Ichigo, Uryu, and Chad all face a Privarone Espada. Ichigo, like in the Soul Society, fights the strongest of the three. He gets dog-walked in Shikai, closes the gap in Bankai, and then absolutely annihilates him when he puts on his Hollow Mask. Uryu struggles a tiny bit, but he really does fine, which is consistent because he actually puts up a good fight against Yami. And is why at this point I'll actually say I think Uryu is closer to Bankai Ichigo than Shikai Ichigo at this point in time. Now, Chad's fight is a little bit more complicated. In the beginning, Chad is definitely losing, although he is able to contest the Privarone. It's not quite as bad as what was happening to Shikai Ichigo. But when Chad gets his big power up, his second arm, which depending on how you look at it could be considered his equivalent to a Shikai or a Bankai, he begins to absolutely annihilate the Privarone. No contest whatsoever. Gaining this second arm basically increased Chad's stats across the board like crazy. He's faster now, he hits harder now, he has better defense now. Even when Gantabane goes into his resurrection, he stands no chance. It doesn't close the gap at all between him and Chad. And this is extremely important, because yes, Gantabane is weaker than another Privarone like Dordoni. But while Ichigo's Bankai basically just closed the gap between him and Dordoni, Chad's second arm created a gap between him and Gantabane so large that his resurrection didn't even do anything. Plus, Chad was still injured from the fight before he had his second arm. So at this point, I would say that Chad with one arm is pretty close with Shikai Ichigo, and Chad with two arms is closer to someone like Uryu or Bankai Ichigo. Granted, not as strong, just relative, and you also have to keep in mind that Ichigo levels up a lot throughout this arc, so this is more like beginning of Hueco Mundo, not at the end when he's fighting Ulquiorra or heading into Karakura Town, and definitely not with his mask. This becomes even more consistent when you keep in mind that Uryu was able to do things against Yami, even though he struggled against a Privarone a little bit, and Toshiro wasn't able to do anything to Yami without using his Bankai, as he stated himself, which is just more proof that Privarone Espada are pretty close with the likes of lower level Espada and captains, and especially considering the fact that Gantabane is only one rank difference from Luffy. Although the more we learn about Espada ranks, the more we kind of realize how loosely ranked they really are, but still. And that brings us to the very unfortunate encounter that Chad has with Noitora, which is somewhat similar to Soul Society, as at this point in time, Uryu is definitely losing to Noitora, and there's a good chance that Ichigo is losing as well. Although that's not to say that there isn't anything good at all that comes from this fight, at least power scaling wise for Chad, because not only was Noitora cleaning up Chad after he was injured from his fight, but even though Chad's first hit did absolutely nothing to Noitora, just like in the Soul Society arc with Shunsui, it's implied that Chad's final attack with everything he had left could have actually done something to Noitora. This is especially impressive considering the fact that Noitora is supposed to have the best hero among the Espada. So Chad is definitely packing some serious firepower by this point in the series. And at the end of the Arrancar arc, I would say without a doubt in my mind that Chad is actually a captain level fighter. You know, he's no Shunsui or anything, but he's definitely similar in strength to someone like Komamura, or earlier Toshiro, or even Soul Society arc Byakuya. Chad suffers from going up against opponents that are simply out of his pay grade at that point in time, and also being a main character. There are plenty of characters that Chad is stronger than, that people think of as strong combatants and aren't memes, but because they're not main characters, they don't have the same expectations or same encounters that he does. I think a good example of this is Ikaku. Everybody likes Ikaku, and it's even stated that he could be a captain. But Ikaku with his Bankai pretty much tied with a Fraction, and Chad would have annihilated that dude. Chad might have even been able to win that fight after his training with Renji at Kisuke's before getting his second arm. But Ikaku's losing to screen time ratio isn't nearly as bad as Chad's is. Now, things get a little trickier as we move on to the Fullbring arc, as Chad didn't really get a proper fight here. In an anime-only fight, he fights against Tsukishima, and I have heard somewhere online that this was canon and overseen by Kubo, but I couldn't find the source on that. If it is true, it's a big boost for Chad, as he was actually dominating Tsukishima until the hacks kicked in, which were pre-planted in him. And Tsukishima was able to keep up with Byakuya, even before he used his Book of the End, which says a lot about Chad if this is true. However, I'm not going to believe this without any source, so I'm just going to go ahead and say that this is filler. Although it is somewhat believable considering the fact that it's been, I think, nearly a 2-year time skip by this point. And in the 1000-Year Blood War, there's really not too much to talk about. He doesn't actually get any on-screen fights. It did seem like at one point in time he had some plans for Chad to do something, and by extension Ganju, but he didn't end up having the time to do that. Chad did end up training in Hueco Mundo during the 1000-Year Blood War arc, just like Orihime did, and she came out able to compete with Yuha to some extent. And realistically, you would think that Chad, being stronger than Orihime to begin with, would come out the training just as strong, if not stronger than her. But at the same time, Orihime's powers are very unique and very hard to scale. In the anime version of the 1000-Year Blood War, Chad actually managed to block and destroy part of Uryu's Leaf Dragon. And we all know that Uryu is extremely powerful at this point in the series. Hopefully, we see more of this in the upcoming course. Because it really is impossible to say how strong he is by the final arc. We know he trained, we know he got stronger, but we never got to see it. In all honesty, even Fullbring Arc Chad should be able to defeat the lower to mid-level Sternritters. Now, he's not beating Kurge or Mask or Asnot before training, maybe after, who really knows. But a lot of the Sternritter were really only problems because they could steal the Bankai, and they weren't that strong on their own, at least compared to the captains. I mean, you have to keep in mind, Toshiro couldn't even do anything to Yami using his Shikai. He had to use his Bankai. He had to use his Bankai against a Pre-Verona Spada. And granted, yes, Toshiro is definitely stronger than he was all the way back then. But Chad is literally unaffected by the whole Bankai stealing thing. He doesn't have a Bankai to steal. So he can go full power in a situation where the captains weren't able to. But at this point, all we can really do is wait and see. Personally, I hope that he helps in the fight against Yuha, or turns around to fight either another enemy, or goes back and helps Uryu against Hashwolf. His entire thing is having Ichigo's back, so I feel like it would make a lot of sense. And it would even have meaning for Uryu's fight, as Uryu would be the one who stood by his friends, while facing Hashwolf, the one who abandoned his. As long as it's just not a statue. That hurts the heart a little bit.